Frank Holloway, known as the Old Ghost, was a quiet, dismissed figure on a Riverside Park bench, his hands trembling from the cold. He lived an isolated, disciplined life, always watching the sky, never asking for help, only accepting leftover food. After being mocked by teenagers, Frank was unceremoniously removed from the park, gathering his few worn military items with quiet dignity. Yet 12-year-old Liam Carson noticed something profound in Frank's silent resolve. A mysterious, faded cloth bracelet on Frank's wrist, bearing a falcon-triangle symbol, ignited Liam's curiosity. His research led to a shocking discovery. Frank might be Captain Frank Holloway, commander of Echo Unit 6, a special forces team presumed dead after vanishing decades ago in Southeast Asia. Could this overlooked man be a long-lost war hero? If Frank's incredible journey touched your heart, please support our channel. Like this video and subscribe to help us keep sharing these crucial, forgotten stories. Your engagement ensures that voices like Frank's are never ignored again, bringing vital truths to light. Thank you for being part of our community. Get a job, you bum! One of the teenagers sneered, his voice cutting through the morning air like a dull knife. A group of them passed by, their laughter echoing across the otherwise quiet park. Curled on a worn-out bench beneath a canopy of tired trees, the old man didn't move. He was bundled tightly in a tattered army jacket, its fabric frayed and dull with age. His hands, raw and brittle from the early chill, trembled ever so slightly. A city maintenance worker sweeping nearby muttered under his breath, not bothering to lower his voice. "That guy's been here forever. He's part of the garbage now." He didn't look twice. No one did. By midday, a call had been placed to security. The order was simple: remove the old man. He didn't resist. He never did. But neither did anyone offer help. There were no kind words, no second glances, just judgmental stares, hushed voices filled with disdain, and averted eyes that pretended not to see. But exactly one day later, almost to the minute, the stillness of the park was shattered. Thunder cracked above, not from the sky itself, but from the roar of spinning blades. A Blackhawk helicopter descended in a gust of wind and dust, kicking up leaves and startling pigeons into flight. People from nearby shops and apartment buildings rushed to the edge of the park, drawn by the noise, the sight, the sheer improbability of it. The Blackhawk touched down and outpoured soldiers in full gear, helmets, vests, rifles. They fanned out in formation with sharp discipline. Then, from among them, one officer stepped forward, his posture rigid, his face set with purpose. He walked directly toward the same bench that had been cleared the day before. The crowd parted around him like water. He stopped. Then, in full view of everyone, he raised his hand in salute. "Sir," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the park, "we've been looking for you." Silence fell like a curtain. Even the birds seemed to stop in midair. People froze. Phones went up. Conversations died on open lips. Every eye turned to the man who had been dismissed as a nobody just a day earlier. Whispers swirled. Who was this man? This invisible figure they'd all passed by without a second thought? They were about to find out. Frank Holloway had existed in Riverside Park for longer than anyone could remember. No one knew exactly when he had first shown up. At 76, he had become a permanent fixture of the park's landscape, about as noticeable as the cracked pavement or the overgrown roots that curled beneath the aging elm trees. He sat each day in the same spot on the rusted bench that no one else ever used. To locals, he was simply the old ghost. He rarely spoke, and when he moved, it was so quietly that some swore he barely touched the ground. He was alone, always. He didn't beg, he didn't shout, he didn't engage with the chaos that buzzed around him. The barking dogs, the shouting teens, the thud of joggers' footsteps on gravel paths. Frank stayed still, day after day, wrapped in the same faded military-issue sleeping bag that had long since lost its shape and any trace of color. Unlike other homeless men in the city, Frank never held a cardboard sign with shaky letters asking for help. He never asked for anything at all. On the rare occasions someone tried to hand him a few coins, he'd either give a small, polite shake of the head or ignore them altogether. The only thing he accepted without fail was food. left quietly near the edge of the park by a staff member from Leo's Diner across the street. Every evening, just as the sun began to dip, a brown paper bag would appear on the grass. Sometimes it held scraps of toast, other times scrambled eggs, occasionally a sandwich. Frank never said thank you, never made eye contact. He would simply retrieve the bag, quietly vanish into the shadows of the trees, and return again the next morning. Each day began the same. Long before dawn painted the sky, Frank would sit upright, shoulders squared. He'd gaze upward, his eyes locked on some unseen point beyond the clouds. For several minutes, he would remain motionless. Then, in a whisper so soft that not even the wind could carry it, he'd say something under his breath. No one could ever make out the words. This ritual never changed. It didn't matter if it rained, if the wind howled, or if the sun beat down like fire. Frank always looked to the sky. Some who saw him believed he was praying. Others said he was lost in memory. A few thought he had simply slipped into madness, his mind drifting somewhere far from the present. But no one asked. Those who tried never got more than a faint smile or a distant, wordless nod. He kept only a few possessions with him, a canvas backpack that looked as worn as he did and never left his side, a small metal tin tightly sealed with layers of gray duct tape, and around his neck, concealed beneath layers of sweaters and jackets, a set of military dog tags dulled with the time, but still clinking faintly if the wind caught them just right. Only a few observant eyes had ever noticed them. There were whispers, rumors even, about the sleeping bag he used. Some said that if you look at close enough, you could see a patch, an insignia, barely visible after all these years. But no one knew what it meant. Occasionally, another homeless veteran would pass through the park. Most didn't stay, but some would stop at a respectful distance, nod solemnly toward Frank. A few even offered a formal salute. Frank never saluted back. He rarely moved. But those who watched closely saw the change in him. His back a little straighter, his gaze a little sharper. Like a man slipping back into a role he'd never truly left. To the rest of the world, he was still just that old homeless guy. Parents told their kids not to go near him. Runners crossed the path to avoid his bench. Sometimes security guards from the strip mall would try to chase him out, but he always returned. And when he vanished for a day or two, as he sometimes did, he always came back to that same tree, that same bench, facing the same patch of sky. He never explained why. He never said a word. He never asked for anything, not food, not money, not even a glance of pity. And yet, every morning, without fail, he lifted his gaze to the sky as if waiting for something or someone. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was a memory. Whatever it was, it hadn't arrived. Not yet. It all began with laughter. That particular Tuesday morning, the park was more crowded than usual. After several days cloaked in gray skies, the sun had finally broken through, casting warm light over Riverside Park. The grass was dry again, the air inviting. Teenagers cutting class lounged on benches. Couples enjoyed an early lunch under budding trees, and scattered groups gathered in conversation or laughter. The soundtrack of the day was a mix of voices, birdsong, and the now constant sound of phones recording everything. A group of teens, 3 boys and 2 girls, no older than 17, strolled along the park's edge, loud and cocky in their presence. One of them, wearing a neon orange hoodie too loud for spring, held up his phone in front of him like a news anchor on a mission. He spoke with over-the-top excitement, the kind that fed off imaginary followers. "Yo, check it out, people," he said into the camera, spinning to face his friends, then toward the trees. "We're live at Riverside, and what do we have here? Old Ghost in his natural habitat." The camera jerked and zoomed in, wobbling slightly before landing on the outline of a man seated quietly on a bench beneath a tree. Frank Holloway. He wasn't sleeping. His eyes were open, tilted upward, watching the open sky with a kind of stillness that defied the noise around him. At his side sat a weathered backpack, and across his knees, a sleeping bag folded so carefully it seemed out of place among the grime of the street. "Say something, man," the kid called out, camera still rolling. "Yo, you alive or what?" Laughter erupted from the group. "Maybe he's a robot," one of the girls teased, squinting at Frank. "Look at him, he doesn't even blink." "If he's a robot," another boy said, He's a leftover from the last century. The girl raised an eyebrow. A leftover? Yeah, ancient hardware. Vietnam era, maybe. The group roared with laughter again. One of them lightly kicked a small rock toward the bench. It bounced and came to rest near Frank's boots. He didn't flinch, didn't even lower his gaze from the clouds above. This is gold, the boy with the phone said, barely containing his glee. Watch this go viral. They began to circle him, tossing out more insults, mimicking his posture. One of the girls sat cross-legged on the grass nearby, holding an imaginary sleeping bag on her lap and tilting her face toward the sun, mocking Frank's skyward stare. He's probably watching for alien spaceships, she said, grinning. That's when Leo showed up. The daytime security guard, Leo worked the shopping center across the street. He was pushing 60, with a thick waistline and a walk that suggested both authority and chronic back pain. His badge was real enough to make people nervous, even if it didn't carry legal weight. It shimmered under the sunlight as he crossed into the park, his eyes already narrowing at the scene unfolding. What's going on here? Leo barked, tightening his belt out of habit more than necessity. The teens paused, startled, but quickly put on their usual bravado. Just talking to the old guy, one muttered, shrugging. Leo's gaze moved from the group to Frank, then back again. You've made your point, he said flatly. Move along. The teens hesitated, but none of them argued. They slowly drifted away, still smirking. One of them gave a final mocking salute to Frank, 2 fingers to the brow, dripping with irony, before they disappeared around the bend of the path. Leo exhaled and turned back to Frank, his voice lowered, touched with reluctant sympathy. Frank, he said, you know we've had complaints. Families are getting nervous. People want to enjoy the park. Frank said nothing. He hadn't spoken the word of the entire time. I've got to call this in, Leo continued, quieter now. Park supervisors are hearing it from the city. They want non-residents cleared out. He didn't wait for a response. He reached for his radio and spoke into it, voice clipped and official. Less than 10 minutes later, a city patrol car rolled up and parked at the curb. 2 officers stepped out, one young, barely out of the academy, his uniform stiff with newness. The other older, face-lined with years of telling people like Frank that they had to move on. The older officer approached slowly. There was no aggression in his tone, only fatigue. Sir, he said carefully, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings. You can't stay here any longer. Frank didn't argue, he didn't protest. Moving with the weariness of someone carrying not just years, but stories too heavy to share, he leaned forward and began to collect what little he had. First the sleeping bag, torn at the corners, but folded with military precision like it had once belonged to someone who lived by the rules. Then the canvas backpack, faded but clean, its straps worn smooth. And then, from beneath the bench, he reached for 2 items. The first, a pair of combat boots, scuffed, cracked, soles barely holding together. Their laces, though, were tied in perfect symmetrical knots. The second, a small, tarnished military badge. Time had dulled its shine. One corner was chipped off and completely, the edges jagged. It no longer pinned to anything. It had been fastened to a wire, held together by a keyring. A relic, maybe, or a reminder. He packed them slowly, deliberately, with a quiet reverence that made even the younger officer fall silent. No one said a word. No one offered help. And no one mocked him now. They just stood there, waiting, as Frank Holloway finished gathering the fragments of a life once honored, and now forgotten. Frank swung the bag over his shoulder with practiced ease, gave a single nod, and began to walk away from the park. His steps were unhurried, deliberate, like someone retracing a familiar path. Along the sidewalk, life carried on without pause. A hot dog vendor glanced up at the figure moving past, blinked once and returned to his cart. Nearby, a woman scrolling through her phone during her lunch break didn't even glance in his direction. A mother, noticing Frank, instinctively pulled her child a little closer and muttered something low under her breath. Something about people like that. We've grown used to seeing the smudge on coats, the ragged edge of people's lives. But we rarely look through those layers, to the stories tucked behind tired eyes. Frank didn't slow, didn't glance back, and when he passed beyond the gates of Riverside Park, the bench where he'd sat every morning suddenly felt like a void, smaller, still, as though something meaningful had just slipped out of the world, and no one had even noticed it missing. To most, Frank Holloway was nothing more than another invisible man, just one more weathered figure in a city that had stopped paying attention. But to Liam Carson, just 12 years old, Frank was something else entirely. Liam lived only 2 blocks from Riverside Park. His daily route from school always took him through its winding paths, the quickest way home on his bike. At first, Frank was just another odd fixture in the park, quiet, motionless, maybe a little unnerving. Liam, like everyone else, felt a flicker of uncertainty when he passed the man under the tree. But unlike the others, Liam didn't look away. He watched. And with time, he began to notice the details. The way Frank carefully rolled up his sleeping bag each morning, how he never left behind a single piece of trash, how he never panhandled or asked anyone for a thing. Then came the day Liam saw him eat nothing but the end of a loaf of bread, pulled from a wrinkled paper bag. That small, sad meal stuck with him. The next morning, Liam slipped an extra peanut butter and jelly sandwich into his backpack. After school, he coasted slowly through the park, steering toward Frank's usual spot. He said nothing, didn't even make eye contact. He simply set the brown paper bag near Frank's feet and pedaled away. Frank looked up just slightly and gave the barest nod before turning his eyes back to the sky. That simple exchange became a quiet routine. Every couple of days, Liam would bring something, half a sandwich, a granola bar, an apple, whatever he could quietly offer. Frank never refused, never reacted much. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but there was something about him that suggested presence, not absence. Like he wasn't just sitting there, he was waiting, remembering. Always with a kind of stillness that felt intentional. One crisp afternoon, as golden leaves danced across the footpaths and the breeze stirred faint whispers through the trees, Liam lingered. He stood next to Frank's bench longer than usual, watching the older man scan the sky with a look that seemed part habit, part ritual. That's when Liam noticed something on Frank's wrist, a cloth bracelet, old and sun-faded, its edges fraying like the hem of a long-forgotten flag. Just a strip of fabric tied tightly, nothing flashy. But stitched into it, in dark green thread, was a small emblem, the shape of a falcon inside a triangle. Liam's curiosity couldn't be quieted. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. "Sir?" Frank glanced down at his wrist, as if surprised to find it still there. For a moment, he said nothing. Then slowly he smiled, a real one, faint but sure. "It's a gift," he said, voice low and deliberate, like each word had to be carefully dug up from someplace deep. "From who?" Liam asked. Frank paused again, his gaze far off even as he spoke. "My team," he said at last. "We each had one, made it ourselves, before we left." "Left where?" Liam asked gently. Frank didn't answer. He just turned his eyes skyward again. After a long pause, he added quietly, "Not all of us came home." Liam didn't ask anything more. He gave a small nod, climbed onto his bike, and rode home, silent but thoughtful. The image of the bracelet, its symbol, its meaning, burned into his thoughts. That night, Liam couldn't shake it. He pulled out his tablet and began searching, typing in every word he could remember. Falcon-triangle patch military cloth bracelet. The results flooded in, most of them junk. But one image stood out. It was a grainy photograph on a dusty old military forum, buried deep in an archived post from years ago. The image showed a group of men in camouflage uniforms standing in front of a helicopter. Each one wore the same kind of cloth bracelet Frank had. The caption beneath the photo read, "Unit 6, 1978. Last photo before Operation Rainfire." Liam tapped deeper into the thread, heart racing with a strange mixture of excitement and unease. The more he read, the more bizarre and haunting the story became. Unit 6 had been a Special Forces recon team deployed into Southeast Asia on a mission so secret, much of it remained redacted in official reports. What was visible in the declassified sections told enough. The team vanished during Operation Rainfire. The government's official record had them listed simply as missing in action. The photo glowed faintly on Liam's tablet screen, the light catching on the worn edges of the bracelet shown in the image, identical to the one Frank always wore. The story it came with was chilling. A secretive military unit, Echo 6, declared lost in action with no survivors. Every official report concluded the same: presumed dead, wiped out, forgotten by time. But that bracelet, it didn't lie. It matched Frank's in every detail. Liam stared at the screen, unmoving. His mind raced. Could it really be true? Could the quiet man sitting alone in the park, the one people passed with sidelong glances or outright scorn, be connected to this lost unit? Or worse, could he be the only one left? Sleep evaded Liam that night. He turned in bed, mind tangled in questions and possibilities. But one truth stuck with him like a stubborn splinter. Frank Holloway was not just some anonymous, drifting homeless man. Something about his past was bigger, heavier, and whatever it was, it hadn't yet finished with him. Liam didn't keep what he'd found to himself. At breakfast the next morning, just eggs and toast, steam curling from their plates, he laid it all out to his grandfather. Every detail. The strange bracelet, the symbol stitched into it, the eerie search results, and the legend of Echo Unit 6. Robert Carson, Liam's grandfather, listened quietly. A Vietnam veteran himself, he rarely spoke about his time overseas, the memories sealed away like photographs in a drawer no one opened. But when Liam described the insignia sewn into Frank's bracelet, Robert froze. His fork halted in midair. His eyes narrowed. "Say that again," he said, voice low and tight. Liam repeated it word for word. Robert pushed his plate aside and rose slowly from his seat. He disappeared into the living room, heading toward a tall bookshelf where an old wooden box rested, scarred, dust-covered, its surface dotted with faded stickers from now shuttered army bases. He opened it with reverent care, hands steady. From within, he drew out a small stack of aging documents, yellowed at the corners and fragile. He flipped through them quickly but precisely, as if guided by instinct. At last, he pulled out a laminated sheet and handed it to Liam. "Read the name at the bottom," he said. The print was faint, but Liam leaned in and read it. CPT Frank Holloway. Frank. Echo 6. Robert slowly sat down, a heaviness settling into his shoulders. "I thought he was dead," he murmured. "We all did." Then with quiet resolve, he reached for the phone. His fingers dialed a number from memory, a number unused for years. When the voice on the other end answered, Robert didn't hesitate. "Eddie," he said, "I need you to meet me at Riverside Park. There's someone you have to see." Less than an hour later, Robert and Liam stood across the street from Frank's usual bench. There he was, just as always, still, silent, seated beneath the same old tree, gaze cast upward toward the sky. He didn't look their way, didn't acknowledge their presence, but Robert didn't need acknowledgement. He raised his hand and delivered a solemn salute. Frank didn't return it, but his eyes moved, barely, subtly, just enough, and that was all Robert needed. Word moves fast in a small town, especially when veterans are involved. That afternoon, two more older men showed up in the park, both wearing faded ball caps embroidered with unit patches and insignias from long ago. They didn't speak. They didn't ask questions. They just stood across the path from Frank, their eyes locked on him. One by one, they raised their hands in quiet salute. Then they turned and walked away. By the following morning, 5 more arrived, then 7. By the end of the second day, the count had grown to over a dozen. Men who hadn't worn their uniforms in decades pulled them out from closets, brushed off the dust, pressed their jackets, and polished tarnished pins. They came in silence, some alone, some in groups. They stood before Frank Holloway, eyes full of memory and reverence, and saluted the man they now believed that was once Captain Frank Holloway, the long-lost leader of Echo 6. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. And Frank, he didn't speak either. He didn't return their salutes. But he watched, quietly, steadily. His face unreadable. But he saw them. The townspeople started to notice. Shoppers at the farmer's market paused and glanced toward the park. Joggers slowed their stride as they passed beneath the trees. Conversations hushed near Frank's bench. Someone took a blurry photo, Frank on his bench, a row of elderly veterans saluting him in the golden afternoon light. The caption read only, "Does anyone know who this man really is?" The post spread across social media with wildfire speed. By sundown, the town was buzzing. Is he a war hero? Was he a part of a secret mission? I heard he saved his entire squad in Vietnam. No, I heard the government left him behind. Speculation thickened like fog. Rumors bloomed into awe. And slowly a transformation took place. People who once crossed the street to avoid Frank now lingered it nearby. Some brought coffee and left it quietly by his bench. Others kept their distance, unsure of what they were witnessing, but instinctively understanding it mattered. In the middle of it all, beneath the weight of a town waking up to a truth long overlooked, Frank Holloway sat as he always had, quiet, still, waiting. The morning unfolded just as it always had. A pale gray sky stretched over the quiet streets, still clinging to the final threads of dawn's chill. At Riverside Park, the day was beginning to stir. Dog walkers strolled the paths with steaming coffee cups in hand, joggers passed in steady rhythm, and elderly couples ambled along familiar trails, holding hands or chatting softly about the weather. And beneath a familiar cluster of trees near the park's western edge sat Frank Holloway, just as he had every morning for years. He was still, nearly statuesque, a silent fixture of the park. To many, he was simply part of the scenery, an old man with a worn coat, a faded cap, and a gaze always tilted upward, watching nothing in particular. But by 8:15 a.m., something shifted. It began with a low, distant rumble, at first faint, like thunder rolling somewhere behind the hills. Then it deepened, grew heavier. The sound didn't merely echo, it vibrated through window panes, made the sidewalk tremble faintly underfoot. Birds scattered, their wings slashing through the sky in startled flocks. Heads turned. People squinted toward the horizon, hands raised to block the soft glare of morning light. And then they saw it. A UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter sliced across the air above the town. Matte, black, and formidable. It flew low, too low for anything ordinary. The thundering blades cut the wind with the weight of purpose. It hovered for a moment above Riverside Park, its rotor wash sending leaves, dust, and voices swirling into a frenzy. Screams erupted, not of fear, but awe. Children pointed. Cars braked suddenly in the street. Dozens of phones were raised, hands trembling as they recorded the impossible scene. With slow, deliberate grace, the helicopter descended into the wide, grassy clearing beyond the old elm trees. Its landing gear touched down with a deep, padded thud. The blade slowed but didn't stop. Then a door slid open. 4 soldiers stepped out, moving in fluid synchrony. They were dressed head to toe in tactical gear, goggles obscuring their expressions, rifles slung but not raised. Each movement was clean, trained, intentional. They fanned out with discipline that spoke of hundreds of rehearsals. Within moments, a perimeter had formed. The sun caught the drifting dust and golden swirls around their boots. From the dark interior of the helicopter, a 5th figure emerged. This man wore a sharply tailored dress uniform, immaculate in every detail. Rows of medals and ribbons adorned his chest, gleaming in the sunlight. He was in his late 50s, tall and composed, with steel gray hair brushed neatly at the temples and lines carved deep around his eyes. Lines earned, not given. He walked with the weight of memory and command. The park had fallen completely still. The crowd had grown, passers-by, shopkeepers who had stepped out of their stores, veterans who had gathered the day before, all of them held in stunned silence. No one dared speak. No one moved. The officer didn't acknowledge the crowd. He didn't scan the faces or wave. His focus was fixed. With quiet authority, he walked directly to the figure beneath the trees. Frank Holloway, who hadn't shifted or turned, still watching the sky as if waiting for something only he could feel coming. The officer stopped in front of him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the officer removed his cap, dipped his head with deliberate solemnity, and said with unmistakable reverence, "Sir, we apologize for keeping you waiting." The words struck like a bell in a cathedral. Someone gasped. A child whispered, barely audible, "Did he just say, sir?" Frank blinked slowly. Then his eyes rose to meet the man before him. They held the officer's gaze unflinching. No words passed between them. And yet something vast and invisible settled into place. In the heavy silence, time seemed to fold, past bleeding into present, the weight of decades suspended in the quiet air between them. One of the soldiers stepped forward with careful precision. In his gloved hands, he held a neatly folded service jacket, new, crisp regulation. He offered it to Frank without a word. At first, Frank didn't move. Then slowly he stood. His motion was deliberate, not frail. As he rose, his back straightened, not in stiffness, but with a quiet pride, a dignity that needed no explanation. He accepted the jacket and laid it gently over his arm. And then, without speaking, he began to walk. The officer turned beside him, matching his pace. Together they made their way back toward the helicopter, the four soldiers falling in with seamless discipline. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. No one even whispered anymore. Some continued recording, hands now lowered and steady. Others turned off their phones altogether, sensing, without being told, that this moment was too sacred for screens. As Frank and the officer disappeared into the open belly of the helicopter, the ramp slowly closed behind them. The engines flared, the blades spun faster, and with a deep shudder, the Blackhawk lifted again into the sky. It rose above the rooftops, turning eastward until it was just a black streak against the morning light. The dust it stirred took longer to settle. People stood rooted in place, gazing at the bench under the trees where Frank Holloway had sat each day for years. That bench would never look the same. Something had changed forever, not just in the park, but in the town's memory. Because whatever they had assumed about the quiet man who watched the world go by from beneath those branches, they now understood the truth. He had never been forgotten, only misplaced. Until now. And almost as soon as the sky swallowed the helicopter, the questions began. By noon, the news vans had arrived, white, blocky, loud. Local reporters planted themselves in the park, broadcasting with wide-eyed urgency. The internet surged with clips and blurry snapshots. Stories bloomed. Speculations spread like wildfire. The story was simply too extraordinary, too charged with the quiet drama of real life, to be overlooked. But it wasn't until the Department of Defense stepped before the nation the following day that the full truth emerged. A solemn podium stood at the center of the press briefing room, framed by two American flags on either side. A high-ranking Pentagon spokesperson, flanked by senior military officials in full uniform, faced the cameras. What began as a standard public statement soon unfolded into a sweeping correction of American military history, one that no one, not even the seasoned reporters in the room, could have anticipated. Yesterday, the spokesperson began with careful gravity. The United States military successfully reestablished contact with Captain Franklin T. Holloway, former commanding officer of Echo Unit 6, a covert reconnaissance team long presumed lost during a classified operation in Southeast Asia in 1978. The room stirred with gasps and low murmurs. For over 45 years, the spokesperson continued, Captain Holloway had been listed as missing in action, presumed dead, following the disappearance of his unit during a high-risk mission deep within the Laotian jungle near the final chaotic months of the Vietnam War. What followed next shocked not only the press corps, but also veterans across the country who watched the broadcast unfold. According to newly declassified segments of a once-sealed military report, Echo 6 had been ambushed during their mission. 5 men under Captain Holloway's command were captured. With no viable options for extraction and no time to spare, Holloway made a decision that few would have imagined. He chose not to retreat. He did not radio for backup. Instead, he vanished. He stayed behind enemy lines, disappearing deliberately into hostile territory, determined to recover his men on his own. For weeks, he tracked them. He moved alone through dense, unfamiliar jungle, surviving off the land, collecting intelligence, slipping undetected past enemy patrols. Eventually, against staggering odds, he managed to locate and liberate 4 of the 5 captives. One soldier, tragically, had already been executed. The remaining 4 were barely alive when Holloway led them through miles of unforgiving terrain back toward friendly territory. They had no radio, no supplies beyond what they could scavenge, and still, they survived. By the time they reached American forces, The men were gaunt, exhausted, and barely coherent. But Holloway didn't stay. He personally handed over the rescued soldiers to a secondary unit and then, without saying a word, slipped away once more, this time vanishing deeper into the jungle, choosing solitude over recognition, sacrifice over ceremony. When pressed by a journalist as to why Holloway never returned to receive honors or even acknowledgement, the Pentagon spokesperson paused. Captain Holloway, they finally said, suffered from what we now understand to be severe combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time, it went undiagnosed, unspoken. Like many veterans of his era, he was deeply uncomfortable with medals or public attention. After returning to the United States under an assumed identity, Holloway refused military benefits. He declined any offers of assistance. He lived quietly, drifting from state to state. Montana, Texas, New Mexico, never settling, never staying long in any one place. He worked when he had to, often in silence, never granting interviews, never revealing who he truly was. His identity remained buried, even to those who knew him in passing. It wasn't until a photograph began circulating online, taken near a Blackhawk helicopter parked in Riverside Park, that someone in military intelligence noticed a small but unmistakable detail: a frayed cloth bracelet on Holloway's wrist. It was a distinctive band, one that had been issued only to members of Echo 6. The photo set off an immediate investigation. Fingerprints were checked against long-archived military records. DNA from an old personnel file was tested. The match was undeniable. Within hours, the ghost that had wandered America for decades had a name again: Captain Franklin T. Holloway. War hero, commander of one of the most elusive and revered units in U.S. military history. The nation, stunned and awed, realized it had never properly thanked him, until now. As the press conference came to a close, a reporter called out over the hushed crowd, asking whether Captain Holloway would be awarded the Medal of Honor. The spokesperson's response was soft, almost reverent. "The department is currently reviewing that," they said, "but from what we've come to understand, Captain Holloway never wanted medals. He wanted peace. And somehow that explained everything. He hadn't returned to be celebrated. He had come back because whatever had kept him in the shadows, pain, guilt, memory, or the quiet burden of survival, had finally begun to loosen its grip. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was weariness. Or maybe it was the silent ghosts of his past that had finally demanded to be seen, not by the world, but by those who would understand. Weeks went by, yet the events of Riverside Park refused to fade. The old elm tree under which Frank Holloway had once sat alone now stood beside something new. The city, moved by the story that had shaken the nation, installed a polished stone bench, modest but dignified. Fixed into the bronze plaque at its center were the simple, enduring words: Frank Holloway, the quiet guardian of peace. Beneath those simple words etched into the stone was a smaller inscription, delicate, nearly hidden, meant for those who had served without ever seeking recognition. Every morning, just after the first light of day broke across the town, people began arriving near the bench where it all began. At first, it was only a handful of veterans. Some wore their old uniforms, pressed and proud. Others came in everyday clothes, their posture still holding traces of discipline and years gone by. They stood in silence, nodding to one another, eyes misting as they paid their respects. Soon it wasn't just veterans. Teachers began bringing their classes, neatly lined rows of students standing beside the flagpole, quiet and wide-eyed. Some kids saluted, unsure but sincere. Others simply lowered their heads. The bench became more than a seat. It became sacred. What had once been an unspoken gesture of remembrance evolved into a daily ritual that spread across the community like sunlight warming cold pavement. Liam Carson, now recognized by many in town as the boy who had helped reveal the truth, was invited to speak at the school's Veterans Day Assembly. He stood center stage in the gymnasium, nervously gripping a piece of paper, his voice trembling slightly as he began to read. "My name is Liam," he said, his gaze shifting toward the crowd of parents, students, and veterans. "And I want to tell you about someone who didn't live in a big house. He didn't wear medals. He didn't drive a nice car. He lived on a bench." The crowd leaned in. He didn't talk much. People thought he had nothing. But the truth is, He gave everything. With both hands, Liam held up a photograph of the simple cloth bracelet. Its worn threads seemed to say more than words ever could. Some heroes don't wear armor, he continued. Some don't even want to be called heroes. Some carry a sleeping bag, eyes that have seen too much, and ask for nothing in return. A profound silence settled over the gym. You could hear a pin drop. People listened not just with their ears, but with their hearts. We walked past him for years, Liam said quietly. We never really saw him, but he never stopped watching over us. And now that we finally do see him, let's never forget him. Frank Holloway had once again disappeared, now somewhere in the care of the same military that had, for a time, lost track of him. But this time he hadn't vanished unnoticed. His memory had already taken deep root in the town's heart, not because of grand speeches or booming parades, not because of a newspaper article or a viral video, but because of a quiet bench, because of a story no one was willing to ignore anymore. In a world where appearances often deceive and distraction comes easy, Frank's story served as a gentle, powerful reminder to pause and ask ourselves, who are we not seeing? Is it the veteran standing quietly in line behind us at the grocery store? The janitor mopping the hall after hours? The elderly man sipping coffee alone at the corner diner? How many have served, sacrificed, and then quietly slipped into the background without a word? For those who grew up in different times, times of service, integrity, and quiet resilience, Frank's story may feel deeply personal. You may have known someone like him. You may be someone like him. You remember what it meant to serve without thanks, to live with dignity that didn't need applause. And for the younger generations, this story carries its own message. The importance of paying attention, of listening with care, of refusing to judge too quickly. It teaches us that true respect means seeing someone not for what they have, but for who they are and what they have given. So now we ask you, have you ever met a Frank Holloway? Someone the world passed by until one day you finally saw them? If so, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us your story. Let others know that these moments, these quiet truths, still matter. And if this story touched you, consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and helping us continue to bring forgotten voices into the light. Because stories like Frank Holloway's don't just deserve to be told, they deserve to be remembered. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next time.